all that being said?
Many of my off-grid homes are off-grid out of necessity. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons why a client is not simply making a luxury decision, but an economic decision for going off-grid. And also we'll establish reasons why when you're designing a solar-powered home at this point, why you might want to consider going off-grid or at least designing it with the mindset of off-grid living as far as system expansion goes. So we're going to start out by making some arguments against being grid connected, and so that we can better understand why buildings would be going off grid. This program does have more of a residential focus, but a lot of the arguments do apply to commercial as well. We have a program for commercial that is for small arrays called solar peakers, where the solar array may only do 10% of a building and charge a battery and discharge that battery during peak times. It's very cost effective for grid tied commercial. Then again, at some point next year, it looks like I'm going to be doing an off grid hotel for similar reasons that homeowners here in Mississippi do off grid residential homes. And the primary reason is the cost of grid expansion. So, in the case of this hotel, it is surrounded by water. It's on an island, and so the cost of bringing power out to the island is prohibitive. In a residential setting, it can simply be that your client has bought, let's say 40 acres of land out in a rural area, and then they call the electric cooperative, and the cooperative says, normally we're required to bring power out to your property, and generally they do not charge the customer the true cost of bringing the power out to that property. That's kind of what they get in exchange for that monopoly is they have to serve every customer in that region, and they look at bringing the grid out to that customer off the side of the road as simply expanding their revenue base. But generally, once you start to live about more than 500 feet from the home, they start charging you the true cost of grid expansion, and these costs can be rather substantial, and it only goes up from there the further away you get. And so, I have a customer who's living about a third of a mile. My first off-grid customer is living about a third of a mile off of the edge of the property, and it went across a creek. And so the power company was going to charge him over $20,000 to bring power out to where exactly he wanted to build. And so he said, well, that's $20,000. I would rather chunk into a battery bank. I already wanted to do solar. And so, even though solar and batteries and off-grid living is expensive, depending on the job site and depending on the services that are to site, it is cost effective to say, well, let's abandon the concept of the grid connection. And especially if you're going underground with your cabling, that grid expansion cost can get very expensive. Although perhaps less so in rural areas than non-rural. Overhead wiring is cheaper, obviously. One kind of point that I'd like to bring up is that solar is often attacked for being an unreliable fuel source, and that may not be the right term. Grid tied solar loses its ability to power the home when the power goes out. That's a safety feature, if the solar array is simply dumping any excess power back into the grid and selling back to the utility, the con, that's the pro, is you can sell back to the utility. The con is when the grid fails, the utility needs to make sure that you're not pushing power back onto the grid when they're repairing the grid. And so a grid tied solar array without batteries, without any transfer switch or switch gear, cannot power the home while the power is out. And that's a disappointment to some customers. However, by the time you say, well, you want to add, what are you doing solar for? Are you doing it for economic reasons, or are you doing it to not lose power during a blackout? That starts to divide the customers into two groups. One who's willing to pay more for that functionality that would normally be served by like a backup gas generator, versus the customers who are only doing solar for economic reasons, at which point it's often better to ditch the batteries and have these grid tied arrays. But I would say that those systems are incomplete. What it used to be back in the day, when solar was much more expensive than it is today, it was completely an off-grid market. And you would only do solar in areas where the cost of grid expansion was very cost prohibitive. And then you see TV shows on today, like there's one on, I think it's the Discovery Channel, that's called Off-Grid Living or something like that, where these customers are doing very small off-grid setups, and saying, oh, it's great to live off-grid, but those systems don't produce a whole lot of power. What we're trying to talk about today is, how to size systems that would power a regular sized home off-grid, and what the components and costs involved are. But back to that point about grid reliability and solar reliability, and it's a parallel point to the difference between overhead wiring and underground wiring. Of course, overhead is cheaper than underground, but at the same time, there's nothing more reliable than generating your own power on site and storing it in a battery. When I have an off-grid customer and a big thunderstorm rolls through, and it takes out the rural grid, I don't have to worry about my customer losing power. They're generating it fine on site. This particular house that we're doing is a hybrid grid tied and off grid system, and we'll talk about what that really entails. But in this particular case, the budget was not large enough to take the house completely off grid. But at the same time, if we size the battery bank and the array enough to be more than sufficient, that if a hurricane comes through or a tornado comes through in Mississippi and wipes out the grid, that they can just kind of hunker down and still have air conditioning and refrigeration and all the modern conveniences of electricity. But just by conserving their electricity a little bit more, they can kind of coast through the disaster until the grid gets repaired. And this is more of a rural issue than a city issue, because in rural communities, if you're in a very rural area and you're at the very end of the line, your grid repair is going to have a lower priority than in a higher population center. And so there were areas in Mississippi when Hurricane Katrina came through, it was like 94% of Mississippi lost its power during Hurricane Katrina, but there were rural areas that were out of power for weeks, if not a month or two, in the most rural settings. And so, those homeowners had to leave their homes, not because they sustained any damage because of the hurricane, but simply because they did not have access to electricity. And so, when I see solar being discussed at the policy level in front of public utility commissions. They say, oh, well, solar is unreliable. I kind of take issue with that because, I know from experience that my off-grid customers are, it's like, okay, overhead is less reliable than underground. But then again, underground is less reliable than generating the electricity and storing in a battery, right at the point of use, provided that the system is well sized. And so we will talk about what entails a well sized off grid system in the next section of this program. At the same time, there are, I'd say, the policies for grid tied solar are in most cases getting worse rather than better. So you can call them subsidies, and you wouldn't be wrong. But the subsidy programs for solar that really started getting off the ground in 2005 are now on the decline, and so not only is there a discussion of buyback rates from the customer to the utility, but there's also discussions of, well, what's the mandatory minimum bill for a solar home? And just taking a step aside from solar, let's just talk about where are grid connection fees high. So that, it's kind of the same thing as a mandatory minimum, where we're used to thinking about our electric bill as something that's metered. So you use 1 kilowatt hour of electricity and your rate is 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and you're billed 11 cents for every kilowatt hour you use. Well, there's another component of your bill that are fixed fees. And so what kind of rates have high fixed fees? This is just a smattering of different kinds of rate structures where the fixed fees can exceed $50 a month. And what we see is, generally the fees are related to commercial buildings. It's not unusual for commercial fees to be, $125 a month for the meter fee, rather than many residential customers have meter fees of $11 or so. But what we can see is for residential fixed fees, if you have a residential property that has other commercial uses, such as a farm, maybe if your home is so large that you need three-phase service, or maybe if you have an apartment complex that has one master meter on it, those are more commercial-like charges. But then we also see net metering, where some cooperatives are now saying, well, we'll give you net metering, where you get a one-for-one exchange for every kilowatt hour you push back onto the grid. We'll credit you a kilowatt hour at our metered rate, but we're going to up the fixed fee to make up for that revenue loss. So whether or not that's fair or disingenuous, I'll leave for after class discussion. But some other areas where you do just get into basic high residential fixed fees would be remote areas, like up on top of the mountain. On a mountaintop, it costs more to bring the grid out there. When trees fall over power lines on mountaintops, they're more costly to repair. And also seasonal buildings, like the proverbial ice fishing cabin up in Wisconsin or Minnesota, where that building is only going to be used for a couple of months a year. They're not going to give you, in most cases, a smaller meter fee. They're going to say, well, if you're only powering the building for 4 months a year and then calling us, say we want to disconnect our meter and we'll see you in 8 months from now, they're going to make sure that they get that revenue because they're not dividing that bill across the entire year. And so then I took a closer look to say, well, aside from those kind of specialty rates, how high are fixed fees getting in the United States for just basic residential grid tied homes where there's nothing really special about that home, like the examples we just discussed. Out in Mississippi, the fixed fees are pretty high. When you're inside the city, the fixed fees are around $14. But when you get out into the rural electric cooperatives, the fixed fees jump up to anywhere between $22 and $27 a month. Um, and so that I kind of surveyed electric bills throughout the country, and these bills came to the top for having the greatest fixed fees for just their standard residential service. And what struck me about this list is it wasn't New York City or California, areas that are notorious for having high electricity pricing. These are like breadbasket countries, Indiana or Ohio. And what really stands out about this list is they're all in rural electric cooperatives, where that rural cooperative is saying, we basically have to have higher mandatory minimum bills because we have fewer customers per mile of power line that we maintain. And so that's a little bit, it's kind of sneaky where some of these cooperatives will say, oh, we have average electrical pricing at 10 or 11 cents a kilowatt hour. But if you can imagine, if you're a very small home, if you're an energy efficient home, if you're a solar home, and you're not buying that much electricity from the grid, the fixed fee can be rather high, rather a large portion of your electric bill. And so at that point, going off grid would save you not only the energy rate, but also the meter fees, which are only going to go up. As more people start generating their own electricity, the grid operators will say, hey, Public Utility Commission, we need to restructure our electric rates. And these can be solar discriminatory, where they only apply to solar customers. But the meter fees that you see in front of you on the screen right now are not solar discriminatory. They apply to all customers on that grid. My first off-grid customer, and then the reason why we put in a large battery bank on this site was not just to power the home off the batteries for a couple of days, but we're also bumping into the harsh reality that if you want to generate 100% of your electric bill by solar, so if you want to eliminate your electric bill with solar, let's say you ignore the fixed fees and you say, okay, I don't mind paying, $15 a month or $20 a month for grid connection. Having that grid connection there, if I ever need it, is to me the same value as having a backup gas generator, so that if there's something goes wrong with my solar array, I still have a secondary source of power to operate on while I'm servicing whatever's gone wrong with my solar array. Those are common values for off-grid customers to have. And sometimes it becomes a trade-off to say, well, if I'm truly off-grid, I want a generator. But if I'm 500 feet from the road and the utility is willing to come in and interconnect me to the grid, instead of having a generator, I'll just use the grid as that generator, which is less hassle, but it's also not perhaps as reliable because, of course, if the grid goes out, then you need the electricity. We're going to talk about that later. But the harsh reality is that there's many areas in the country where they don't have net metering, where they don't get a one-for-one exchange for solar buyback. And the federal minimum for buyback is a concept known as avoided cost. And in most areas, avoided cost is around 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And so there is a federal law called PURPO that says if you are a micro generator, which they define as something that's like under 4 megawatts of power, so that's a lot of power. Most residential homes need something that is 1,000th of the size of that to offset their electric bill. But so long as what PURPO says is so long as you're a small generator and your generation source is cleaner than the electric grid, what we're going to do is require your power company to buy back that electricity. And the power company is saying, now hold on a minute. We're a regional electric cooperative. How can we have this federal regulatory oversight? Generally the federal government tries to stay out of state commerce, and that kind of stymies things like national net metering laws, as well as things like internet sales tax. So you could say that perhaps internet sales tax laws are finally bringing down the hands-off federal oversight of regulatory state commerce, and maybe that down the road some wise legal scholar will come in and say, well, wait a minute, Fed is doing online sales tax, and so why can't the Fed do more expansive net metering protections for consumers? Well, the way that PURPO was passed was to say we don't want this to be controversial. We don't want to stir the pot, but we do want to require power companies to buy back electricity that is cleaner than what the utility would otherwise be providing. This was a kind of low-hanging fruit policy that came out of like the Nixon EPA to say, how are ways that we can clean up the electric grid that don't cost a lot of money, and PURPO was one of those policies. And so how we landed on this 3-cent avoided cost buyback rate was to say, this is, when we say avoided cost, what we're talking about is, what is the expenditure that the power company would be making, not on the whole way through the electric bill, but on just what is the raw material cost of coal, what is the raw material cost of gas, and whatever that raw material cost is, instead of buying the coal or buying the gas, we're going to require the utility to purchase, clean, already refined, already delivered to the distribution grid electricity at that avoided cost rate. And they even allow an overhead fee or administrative fee to be backed out of that overcost rate. And so ideally, or I guess in theory, PURPO should not be costing the utility any money because they're buying electricity that's already delivered to the distribution grid at the raw material cost. And so that gets us to the federal mandatory buyback minimum, where the power company is required to buy back at a token amount. But say here in Mississippi, the avoided cost buyback rate is around 3 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas the average kilowatt hour rate is around 12 cents. And so when you buy from the grid, you're buying at 12 cents. When you sell that to the grid, you're selling back at 3 cents. And fundamentally, if you're a solar customer and you offset 100% of your energy use with your solar array, well, your solar array is only working for about 1/3 of the day. The day's 24 hours long. Solar, it really works best between 10 and 2. But it does turn on around 8 and turn off around 5, and so you're only generating electricity for 1/3 of the day, And what that means is if you want to offset 100% of your electrical use, 2/3 of your solar production is either going to go back onto the grid, or it needs to be stored in a battery to be dispatched, when the solar array is not on. And that's on an average sunny day. And so in Mississippi, we don't have a lot of solar power because, at 12 cents a kilowatt hour, solar can be very economic. But at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, I mean, what's kind of a shame is that the big utility scale solar power projects are getting power purchase agreements at a higher rate than what the cooperatives are required to buy electricity from their own members from. And so that's just reality. And so there's a few ways you can overcome that when you're doing grid tied. You can do a battery, which is costly, or you can do a very small array so that you don't have much outflow. Or you would have to do an array that is substantially larger than, that would generate 4 times as much electricity than what you're using to truly zero out your bill. And often there's regulations preventing you from doing that as well. And so it creates this kind of conundrum of, well, how do we ramp up solar at the residential level when the utility is giving you a very low buyback rate compared to the retail price of electricity? And so, that's where you have a solar customer saying, well, to heck with this. I'm not going to sell back any electricity to the power company. I'm just going to store it in a battery and use it when I need it. And so, the problem is batteries cost money and they have a finite life. And so there is a real cost associated with using the battery. And so, as long as the cost differential between the buyback rate and the retail rate, as long as that cost differential is less than the cost to run a battery, that concept of a spiteful battery where you're storing the power rather than selling it back to the utility because you don't agree with their policy, that can actually cost you money because, the batteries, especially like lithium ion batteries at this point in time, have a levelized cost that is greater than, in this case, 11 cents a kilowatt hour or 9 to 10, 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And so we're going to look at different battery technologies and their costs as part of this program. But even a small solar array is going to produce outflow. So if you say, okay, I'm just gonna spend a little bit of money and do a small solar array. So in the summertime, my midday electrical load is about equal to my midday production, and in the wintertime, solar's not as productive. So maybe my electrical load is greater than my production, and so you don't have you undersize the solar array, so you might be only doing 1/3 of your bill instead of 100% of your bill, and that could be fine for summer, and that could be fine for winter. But then again, you still have this problem in the spring or in the fall when your electric use is not very high because you're not running your heat, you're not running your air conditioning. But in the springtime, you have these sunny and also relatively cool days. And so your solar production is maybe in the summertime you get more power or you get more energy out of the array. Energy is power multiplied by time. And so energy is the area under this curve, whereas power is the peak of this curve. And so in the summertime, the days are longer than in the springtime. And so in the summertime, even though you have loss factors such as heat that reduce the amount of power that the array can produce, because the days are longer, you get more energy out of the array. But in the springtime, you get the most amount of power out of the array. It may only be for a couple of hours, but your power from the building is smaller than in the winter or in the summertime. So even a small solar array can still result in an outflow problem in half of the year, in the spring and in the fall. And so it's not just a matter of undersizing your array so that you're not outflowing in the winter or the summer, but then it becomes a matter of undersizing the array so you're not outflowing in the spring or the fall to get that, the most reduction in your electric bill per kilowatt hour produced from the array. And then there's another problem we're going to get to in another slide. But as we said, that concept of storing electricity in a battery, it might appeal to the customer who's mad about their solar policy, but what you would have to have in most cases is what I call the levelized cost of storage, where you take the cost of adding batteries and the battery components, and you divide it by the total energy output of the battery bank, and that levelized cost of storage has to be, has to be less than the differential between your inflow rate and your outflow rate. Otherwise, you're actually increasing your cost rather than decreasing your cost. Now, some customers are fine with a little bit of a cost increase because they're also getting stored electricity on site, and they're doing solar for grid reliability issues. But that's not, the solar that I'm interested in is not just something that is more reliable, but is also something that is more cost effective. And you have to be careful with the concept of storing your solar electricity in a battery for grid tie, because sometimes, depending on the cost of that battery, even though you don't have a very good outflow rate, it would be more economic to sell back to the utility at avoided cost rather than cycling your battery and degrading the battery and losing your battery life and having your battery only last a short period of time. Now, I'd say most customers that are buying these batteries will want to use them. They don't want their batteries just to sit there and hang out. And that, to me, I call that concept a spiteful battery, where the customer is buying the battery to lower their electric bill, even though it's increasing their overall cost and they're not making a return on their investment. They're just doing it because they want solar and they don't want to give their power company any money. And that's not, that's not the most noble of reasons to add a battery to your home. Now, the other problem, what we were just talking about, this undersizing the array so that you don't produce any outflow, the other problem is that the larger the array gets, the more cost effective it becomes in the sense that you get into economies of scale. You take a solar array that may only be 7 or 8 panels, and you're buying less than a pallet. A pallet of solar panels is often 26 solar panels, something around that amount. And so if you're only doing a 7 or 8 panel system, you're busting up the pallet, and that increases your logistical cost. You still got to do the design, you still got to do the interconnection, you still got to do the inspection, you still got to get your crew to site, you still got to get them up on the roof and figuring out where those rafters are and putting holes in the roof. And so by the time you get to, buying a few more solar panels and a few more sticks of racking and having the guys be up on the roof for, maybe 3 days instead of 1 day, that incremental cost is not very much compared to doing a larger project. And so larger projects have greater economies of scale. Utility scale projects install for a much lower rate per watt than residential. commercial projects being large install for a lower rate per watt than residential. Even so, a small residential project per watt costs more than a large residential project per watt. And so if you want to undersize your solar array, even though the effective generation rate is going up because you don't have outflow, your installation cost is going up as well. And so there is an optimal point when you don't have a net metering policy to say, okay, well, a little bit of outflow at avoided cost is okay. And generally, I'll say that that optimal point is buying about one pallet of solar panels. And often when I do projects in Mississippi, given that we don't have very good solar policy, given that we have to do a lot of soul searching with our price point to have the projects be remotely cost effective, I'll generally give my customers the option of, this is what one pallet of solar costs installed. This is what 2 pallets of solar costs installed. And those economies of scale, go all across the board, not just in your labor cost, but your component cost as well. A 3 kilowatt inverter compared to a 10 kilowatt inverter, the 10 kilowatt inverter is 333% the cost of a 3 kilowatt inverter, but only 240% the price. And so, 333% the capacity of the 3 kilowatt inverter, but only 240% the price. So your inverters become more cost effective the larger you get. Your panels become more cost effective the larger you get. Your labor becomes more cost effective the larger you get. And so, there is kind of a sweet spot of about a 7 kilowatt system for a grid tied solar array that does not have good buyback, that does not have consumer friendly solar policy. And then we come back to that fixed fee, where here in on this particular project where we're broadcasting today, the grid connection fee is $20 a month. And so it's like, well, if I'm using 2,000 kilowatt hours a month, and so my kilowatt hour rate is 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and then I'm using 2,000 kilowatt hours, my metered component is $240, and my meter fee being $20, that meter fee is less than 10% of my bill, and my effective rate, if I take my meter fee plus my metered rate and then divide back out by how many kilowatt hours I use, I come out to a 13-cent effective kilowatt hour rate. But the less electricity I use, the larger that metered fixed fee becomes relative to my bill. So whether I'm an energy efficient home, whether I'm a solar home that's not buying a lot of electricity from the grid, or whether there's kind of grandma and grandpa who only turn their air conditioning on when it's time to go to sleep, and otherwise they just deal with the heat during the day because they're very mindful of their electric bill. They get kind of penalized for having lower electrical usage because that fixed fee becomes a larger percentage of the bill, and therefore the electricity that they buy from the grid is more expensive than their energy hogging neighbor. And so, that gets into kind of energy politics, because it's like, well, let's just say you have a flat rate structure. So your rate doesn't go up the more energy you use. Your rate doesn't go down the less energy you use. It's just everyone gets the same 12 cent a kilowatt hour plus $20 a month meter fee. It's flat and simple. Well, even under that flat rate structure, those who use the least amount of electricity end up paying the most for their electricity per kilowatt hour consumed. And so that kind of begs an argument that says if if you are a low energy user, perhaps you stand to benefit more from going off grid than a high energy user. And so the more efficient your home becomes, the less electricity you use, because not just of efficiency, but you're mindful. The smarter your home is, so that you're not running your ceiling fans unnecessarily. Let's say you do some load shifting where you put your deep freeze on a timer so that it only comes on during the day and then it coasts off its thermal mass at night. And all of those tricks that you use to make your home more efficient, the closer you get to taking that building off grid in a cost effective manner, by getting rid of your fixed fees entirely. Another cost of grid connection is whatever fees the utility is going to charge you because of solar. Now, in the past, discriminatory rate structures amongst residential customer classes have been frowned upon. Charging a small energy user or an energy efficient home more for their electricity than an energy hog has by and large struck public utility commissions as being unfair. Say, hey, it's most people don't even look at their electric bills, not to mention understand them, and so we want simple electric rate structures, and they only get more complicated when you get into commercial buildings, larger consumers. But with solar, they'll charge you for meter fees. I have a customer who got billed $90 for upgrading his analog meter to a digital meter, even though the analog meter would just spin backwards. So the analog meter would give him more rate structure protection than what his digital meter does. The digital meter gives him 3 cents a kilowatt hour for his outflow. The analog meter would have given him 12 cents a kilowatt for his outflow, but the power company charged him for the privilege of having that digital meter installed. And then a few months later, he got a notice in his mail that says, the utility is going across every meter in the district and installing digital meters. So it's like he's paying for something that, he wouldn't have otherwise had to have paid for if he had just not been a non-solar customer. And some public utility commissions say this is not acceptable. You're not going to charge solar discriminatory fees. It really depends on your regional politics, and we'll just leave it at that. I would say one trend that we see along the southeast coast is that the power companies, Mississippi Power says if your renewable array is powering your electrical system, and that electrical system is also powered by our grid, even if you have a transfer switch between the two and completely isolate your solar array from the grid, even if you're storing your power in a battery and not outflowing onto the grid, we're still going to consider your solar array to be grid tied and therefore subject you to solar discriminatory fees. And I've talked with, I'd say one of the more progressive public utility commissioners in Georgia, and I just asked them, what if you had the solar on the home and it was powering parts of the home that weren't even connected to the grid, but because the solar owner is buying less electricity, would you consider it fair to subject that solar customer to a discriminatory fee that non-solar customers get? And his response was, well, yes, because it costs money to maintain the grid and the utilities need to make up that revenue loss somehow. And so we would allow solar discriminatory fees on grid connected homes, even if part of the home was 100% off grid and the solar wasn't connected to the grid at all. And, I think that is, even if it's not solar discriminatory, I think that will be the trend in the future, there to try and keep the energy rates low, but increase those fixed fees. So that, I think that will just ultimately, what we see here in Mississippi, having bad solar policy, it forces the solar owners off grid. I think we're more likely to see that become the trend nationally rather than move in the opposite direction. And, I look at that as saying, well, that's kind of a failure of humanity, because we have all these voluntary customers putting more power onto the grid, and it's clean power. And, unlike when we build a new power plant, everybody has to pay 100% of the cost of that power plant, even if you are opposed to the solar tax credit, which right now I'm one of those curmudgeons who will say, I don't think the tax credit is very good policy. But nonetheless, it's reality. But even in this reality, we have these voluntary customers expanding the grid and paying 70% of the cost, with a 30% kick in at the federal level. And so forcing these customers off grid, where you have to oversize the systems, where the systems are going to be less efficient rather than more efficient, because you need to have a surplus of electricity so that you don't run out of electricity. That drives up the cost of renewables onto solar customers. Here in the Tennessee Valley Authority in 2018, on page 1 of their executive summary on their rate structure reports, they explicitly state that they're going to allow the cooperatives to increase the costs on distributed energy resources or consumer-owned resources, so that it is not fair to customers who cannot afford solar or choose not to buy solar. And so we will increase the costs on solar customers. Keep in mind, these are customers who still only get avoided cost buyback for their outflow. We'll just push even more fees onto them. And there's very little, concern for, well, is this unfair to the solar customer, who might be seeking cleaner and more reliable electricity than what the grid can provide. And of course, the Public Utility Commission is supposed to consider health and safety when establishing their policies. But again, that's politics. So let's just keep moving on. But before we do, I want to show you what I have found to be the most egregious solar discriminatory policy. It's in Mississippi. Shockingly, it is on the coastline. And so again, with that health, safety, and welfare mindset, on the coastline, we tend to get hurricanes, and hurricanes tend to take out the electric grid. And this is a cooperative that is marketing itself as a member-owned cooperative. And they say, well, if you're going to put solar onto our grid, we're going to take that meter fee, which is already $20 a month, and we're going to increase it by another $15 a month. And we're going to charge you on top of that an administrative fee, where we take the avoided cost buyback rate and subtract over a penny a kilowatt hour from avoided cost, which is around 3 cents. So we're going to subtract over a penny from that for the administrative fee. And so they're really just hosing anyone on that grid who says, you know what, I want to generate some electricity and have a source of power during the blackout, they're saying, no, we're going to make sure you pay for it if you do, which I don't think is in the interest of health, safety, or welfare, but that is reality, and it's a reality that is only going to continue. And so at some point, we have customers being forced off grid. And perhaps the silver lining is that in Mississippi, the solar installers that do exist in this state, we may be sadists for trying to have a solar business in a state that does not want solar power, but we're also more advanced in our off-grid design and modeling than in states that have, let's just throw a bone to the other side of the political fence and say in states where they have more subsidies for solar, you don't have that battery and off-grid expertise like you do in states which kind of nudge their customers towards off-grid living. And so just as an example, if you take that meter fee and you say, okay, well, just to overcome the meter fee that the utility is placing onto the customer, how much energy do you have to sell back to that company at avoided cost? Because it's all going to be surplus when you're just adding, additional capacity to your array. It's all going to be outflow. So how much larger does the array need to be just to overcome the meter fee? And what this math equation shows is that it's going to be about 4 kilowatts of additional solar power, or about $10,000 of additional solar power just to overcome the solar discriminatory fee for remaining grid connected. So at that point you say, well, how much does a battery cost? And would that money be better spent adding batteries to my array rather than trying to offset these meter fees and not playing that game? And of course, the problem is with a lot of cooperatives, which tend to charge higher fixed fees, as we've seen in previous slides, is their monopolies. And so, in Houston, Texas, you have a completely deregulated grid where you have 50 different people trying to sell you electricity. And what's interesting about Houston, Texas, is Texas doesn't have any net metering laws. There's no net metering mandate or net metering subsidy or solar discriminatory fee allowance or solar discriminatory fee ban. It's the closest thing we have to free market economics in our national electric billing is in Houston, Texas. And in Houston, Texas, there are power companies that are buying back solar electricity at over 3 times avoided cost, over 3 times PURPO. That isn't quite retail value, but closer to retail value, because they want to, A, buy that distributed electricity at cheaper than what they're selling it for, and B, they want to sell the customer the rest of their electric use. So, not all 2-story tall, heavy electric use suburbanite homes have the roof space to offset 100% of their bill. And so in Houston, Texas, the free market economics show that you can pay, you can find power companies willing to buy back at above avoided cost. The flip side of that is, well, Houston, Texas is not a rural area. Houston, Texas has plenty of customers per mile of power line, but in rural areas, you can get down to 5 customers per mile of power line. So there's simply less revenue to go around. So it can be a tough nut to crack, although fundamentally, I would state that the cooperatives that are tasked with bringing electricity to the most rural areas on our electric grid should have more of an incentive to prioritize point of use power generation rather than stymie it. Okay, so these slides should have come a little bit earlier, but it's basically looking at reliability between overhead wiring and underground wiring. And the conclude this is the average customer power interruption per occurrence. And so sometimes, underground wiring, you can get contrarians saying, okay, well, this one underground power outage in 2005, when underground wires do fail, they can take a longer time to repair than overhead. When a tree falls over the power line, you see where the problem is, you remove the tree, you fix the power poles, you might have to run new power lines, you turn the grid back on, and it's not as involved as fixing a problem with underground wires. But where that argument really falls short is when you look at how frequently it happens. Not just for the customer, but for the system itself, and then how frequently it occurs. The overhead power lines get interrupted so much more frequently than underground. And the reason why I'm putting it into this program is to put forward the notion that that putting solar on your rooftop and running the power lines down through the attic to your inverter that's mounted on the side of your wall next to your battery bank, there are no underground lines, there are no overhead lines to fail. And so in that sense, solar is, if you agree that underground wires are more reliable than overhead, then it is no small step forward or large step forward to say, having a well-designed and properly installed off-grid system is more reliable than even underground power lines. Now, another problem with grid-tied solar that doesn't have to do with policy is that the grid-tied battery backup options are simply not very good. And so even if you're the customer who says, okay, I want to be grid-tied, but I want to have some battery backup, you look at most battery inverters on the market that are designed to be grid-tied, and then you look at what their backup options actually are. It's not for whole house generation. It's only for critical load panels. And often it's not for critical load panels that are large enough to run, say, your central air conditioning, which, I grew up in Texas, and if I lose power in Texas, I don't care if my lights go out. I don't really care if my garage door stops working. I don't want my food to spoil, but at the same time, I can always throw a barbecue. We like doing that in Texas. But the last thing I want to go away is my air conditioning. Don't you dare take away my air conditioning. If I lose power, I can deal with anything else, but except air conditioning. And the backup critical load functions of, say, the most popular lithium-ion battery inverters that are grid-tied, SolarEdge makes one. We're going to be talking a lot about the SolarEdge product from a technical reason. But they can only back up about 2 kilowatts of power. And a lot of central air conditioners could be 10 kilowatts or 15 kilowatts. So it's just not large enough to do much more than, keep the lights on and maybe your refrigerator running. So that's not very exciting. The fact that you can say, okay, well, you lose power when the grid goes out if you have a grid-tied array, unless you add a battery. But then you go and you add a battery, and the grid goes out and you still lose power except for a few small electrical loads. And there's a few reasons that are code driven for that. What code says is that, when you're supplying power, you have to supply enough power. And so, SolarEdge says, well, our critical load is only capable of outputting 2 kilowatts of power, and that's not enough to supply an entire house. And so we're only going to allow you to supply, very small loads. You're not allowed to run your, central air conditioning unit off of our critical load panel because it won't work. And so the grid goes out, and maybe your batteryless grid-tied inverter goes out, but then you have a battery inverter tied to a lithium-ion battery here, and the power gets redirected to a critical load panel and not your whole house. Well, you might say, well, that's not acceptable. So what would really happen if, I redirected my SolarEdge battery inverter and I didn't want to power a critical load panel, but I wanted to power my whole house and just manage my electrical load accordingly? So I could choose by flipping breakers on my service panel what I was going to power and not have to rewire my whole house with a critical load panel. And this is something that I really like about the off-grid market, is that there's a little bit more ambition in the customers to say, I don't really care about the warranty of my battery inverter. I care more about, powering what I want to power during a blackout. And so even if not using the inverter per its warranty, most customers would say, well, I'm spending so much money, I want to keep everything within warranty. But from a technical perspective, there is a transfer switch that's a manual transfer switch that you can install in your electric service panel. It's called a interlock. And basically, it's a metal plate that forces an either-or option, so that in this manual interlock, it actually goes at the top of your service panel, whereas most solar, if you're doing a load side connection, is going to be interconnected at the bottom. But what this either-or option gives you is the ability to choose, do I want to run off my main breaker, or what happens during a blackout is you readjust this plate and move this plate so that the main breaker is forced off and your backup generator breaker is turned on. And so that's a very common configuration if you're adding a small backup gas generator to a house to power the house during an emergency. And you're still going to run into that problem where that generator is going to be undersized compared to your main. So this you might be able to fit up to 100 amp breaker along this at this bus bar, but it's not going to be like a 200 amp breaker that would only fit at the top feeding that panel. But there is a technical capability where you could take the battery output of your SolarEdge inverter that is designed to feed, say a 30 amp or 25 amp breaker on a critical load panel, and instead wire it to the breaker at the top of your bus bar on a generator interlock switch, so that you don't have to deal with the critical load panel, that you could presumably power your entire service panel with it, but you will run out of electricity. You're still not going to be able to power your air conditioning. And you could void your warranty by doing that. Basically drawing too much power out of your solar inverter and your solar battery, it will cause your electricity to start blipping all over the place. You're going to have to make sure your electricity breakers are carefully managed if you're going to do that. And that's hard on the inverter as well. It's not designed for that. So they'll say, oh, we're going to void your warranty. We only want you to power a critical load panel that is right sized for the load you're trying to provide. And so if you want whole house backup, say, no, I'm doing solar, and when the grid goes out, I want my whole house to be powered. Then you're going to have to get into larger battery inverters, larger components that are capable of powering your whole house. And more than likely, you're going to have to get into expensive transfer switches to act as a go-between. So, for example, on the home we're doing right now, we have a 200 amp transfer switch. And so normally on a solar array, I'm just going to sketch a little line diagram here, but you have your utility transformer, and then you have your main panel with a main breaker and a bunch of sub breakers. And sometimes solar is tied into the bottom of the bus bar, but generally if you're trying to power the whole house, you're going to put what I call an energy distribution panel between the utility transformer and your main. And if it's grid tied, it goes as simple as that. But then when it's grid tied, if the grid goes out, your energy distribution panel goes out too. So what we've done instead is put a transfer switch Let me change my color here. Back on my pen. What we've done instead is put a transfer switch here that will switch between the grid and our energy distribution panel such that under normal operation, the home is being powered solely off the energy distribution panel. Although our particular kind of inverter has an AC grid charger so that we still can charge the batteries with the grid while the grid is online. But then if, say, our solar array battery system, which is only capable of outputting about 36 kilowatts of power under a surge condition and 15 kilowatts of power under normal continuous operating, which is generally enough for a two-person home. But this home is a large home, and it's designed for two people, but it's also designed for the extended family to come over on the holidays, and they want to have a blowout. Thanksgiving, New Year's, Christmas, 4th of July. What's nice about our transfer switch is we can switch between the grid and the off-grid system so that if they ever wanted their full, about 50 kilowatts of power, they can just turn the off-grid solar array completely off for the couple of days during that month when they're having their blowout. Then everyone goes home and they pull the switch back. And what's kind of interesting about this is, even though these manual transfer switches are expensive, you still have to, most utilities still require an external knife switch disconnect for the solar array. So instead of spending $200 on a simple knife switch disconnect switch, we spend $750 on a knife switch disconnect that's also a manual transfer switch. And then you could presumably have an automatic transfer switch on top of that. That would be even more expensive. Man, I'm popular today. And so some of the problems with grid tied inverters are they are more expensive than the completely off grid inverters. They have more protections and provisions in them. For example, they have to be able to detect when the grid is present or not present, so that they're not backfeeding on the grid, so that they trigger a transfer switch. And then also, most of the grid tied inverters are geared towards lithium ion batteries, which, maybe 5 or 6 years from now will be as cost effective as the most cost effective lead acid. But today, they're still substantially more expensive than the most cost effective lead acid. And so, for trying to have your cake and eat it too, with a grid connected inverter that can outflow onto the grid and then can isolate the home and provide whole house backup, you're buying a whole lot more components and a lot more expensive components to get that functionality. And that's why most, even when they're buying these lithium ion battery inverters, are still only powering critical loads. Furthermore, the lithium ion batteries are designed to be optimized for grid connection. And so when we think about off grid living, most of the decisions are, well, do we want a 12-volt battery or a 24-volt battery or a 48-volt battery? Normally, you're going to go with a 48-volt battery. It just is often you'll get inverters that are rated for 24 volts and for 48 volts. And so by going with the 48 volt setup, you're going to get twice as much throughput through that inverter than with the 24 volt setup. And so your inverters are going to be just simply more cost effective to go with the higher voltage. And lead acid is low voltage friendly. So it's very easy to take, 4 12-volt lead acid batteries and string them up together to get a 48-volt battery bank. A volt times an amp is a watt. And so to get the amount of kilowatt hours that you need to run a house off grid with lead acid, you're generally dealing with low voltage and high amperage. But your lithium ion batteries are generally geared around towards grid connection. And the problem and they're geared around towards efficiency. When you're selling back to the grid, the efficiency really matters. As we'll learn in a little bit, when you're living off grid, the efficiency doesn't matter as much because you always have this surplus of power. It's kind of strange, with off-grid living, you want to make sure you don't run out of power, so you have a surplus of power, so efficiency doesn't matter. When you're grid connected, you want to sell every single kilowatt hour either to the house or sell it back to the grid, and so efficiency does matter. And so they say, okay, well, if I'm up at my solar array is normally going to operate, around 500 volts. It has a 600 volt maximum. And so the normal operating is going to be around 500 volts. And then by the time you get to your electric service panel, you get down to 240 volts. Well, if I take the 600 volts and I step it all the way down to 48 volts, and then I step it all the way back up to 240 volts, there's a lot of efficiency loss in that process. So a lot of these lithium ion batteries are instead going to be operating around 400 volts. And so it'll just do a slight step down to 400 volts going into the lithium ion battery, and then, a slight step down to the 240 volts to power your home, or maybe 350 volt nominal. And so a lot of these lithium ion batteries are very high voltage and very low amperage. So they're just kind of a different kind of battery. And so to kind of argue against the grid, you'd say, Grid-tied batteries are really not about providing whole house backup. They're more about lowering your electric bill. And as we discussed in our commercial solar peaker class, commercial customers are billed differently for their electricity than residential. And so lithium ion batteries can be very, very cost effective for commercial customers that are trying to dispatch that lithium ion battery only a few hours a month, only during peak times. Off-grid living's different. You're living off your batteries for 2/3 of the day, or more. You're living off your battery during multiple cloudy days. So you need a lot more storage to live off-grid than just to do, a couple of hours of load shifting. So grid-tied batteries are more in tune with optimizing your electric bill for load shifting and not really about providing backup power to the entire building. The power companies don't want to lose their customers, so they're not going to work with you. More than likely, they're going to work against you. There's only the most, the pioneers in the industry are finding solutions where the power companies look at distributed power as an asset rather than as a competitive threat. Living off grid with a well-sized, properly installed system is more reliable than the grid. Not to say that the grid isn't reliable, but it does fail. And it tends to fail more in rural areas than in cities. And so you might find yourself in a situation like we do in Mississippi, where you actually get a quicker payback if you go off-grid entirely than if you remain grid connected, because of those fixed fees and meter fees and bad buyback rates. The only caveat being you need a lot more capital up front to do a complete off-grid conversion than to do a grid-tied system. It's a smaller market for sure. And so that's kind of an interesting takeaway from this point, is that there are customers out there who can be in a better position economically by going completely off-grid rather than remaining grid-tied. And it follows that these are markets where the solar policies are unfriendly towards consumer-owned solar. So how do you design an off-grid battery bank? How do you know how much power you need in a battery to run the house off-grid? Most of the time, the customer is only going to have, a track record of how much electricity they've used. And that might be in their old building and they're going into a new building. So how do you model, how do you go, even when you have month-by-month consumption, how do you go from month-by-month consumption to day-by-day consumption to hour-by-hour consumption, and also account for the fact that some days are going to be cloudy and some days are going to be sunny? Well, we'll show you. Now, the starting point is to make a list of all your electrical devices, particularly your heavy electrical devices. And so, that gets back into kind of old school solar design. The battery-less net meter design, you would just look at how much electricity you use over the year and try and install an array that produced that much of electricity over a year, because you're getting a one-for-one exchange from your power company. That's, putting the soft mittens on for your solar design. It doesn't take a lot of expertise to do that. A lot of that design has now been automated. But now you need to know all of your heavy-duty electrical devices because you need to know how much power you need when all these devices come on. Of course, not all these devices are going to come on at the same time. Now, this is an approach that solar design software called Aurora Solar has done, where they say, okay, we know how much electricity you're using a month, and so we're going to divide that electricity by how many days are in the month and assume that that is how much electricity you're going to use in a day. Now, that assumption is a little disingenuous because some days are going to be hotter than others, some days are going to be cloudier than others, but this is just a assumption, and maybe this assumption has erred is too aggressive, and so you would then have to kind of do a guess at a fudge factor and make sure you're not using this as a pinpoint assumption, but still giving yourself enough headroom above and beyond this. But the point of this graph is saying, okay, well, here is my wintertime electric bill, where what we see in orange is our electric heat. And here's my summertime electric bill. And now this electric bill must be for a home in a northern climate, because they're using a lot of electric heat in the winter and just a little bit of air conditioning in the summer. But here in this light aqua is your air conditioning load. And so what we can see is that in the summertime, the air conditioning load really starts to ramp up in the afternoon, whereas in the wintertime, your heating load is more towards the morning. And then here's like a springtime scenario where you have maybe some air conditioning in the afternoon and heating in the morning. And so these kind of wavy graphs are called load profiles. And actually now with these digital meters, sometimes you can log into your electrical account and download this load profile data within your electrical account. If you don't have this load profile data and you really want to know what it is, you can find electrical sensors to install inside your electric service panel that'll start gathering this data for you, which can be a really fun upgrade for you if you just want to spend a little bit of money now but kind of dream about off-grid living in the future. Starting to identify this kind of data will help you right-size your system. But what are some lessons learned here? Well, one is our scale is a little bit off. This is 8 kilowatts, this is 5 kilowatts, and this is 4 kilowatts. So in the springtime, we see our maximum is less than in our summertime. And then really it's in the wintertime in the morning, if you're on electric heat, when you see your maximum load. The exception being if you live in the southern half of the United States, you might not even have electric heat, you might have gas heat, and then you would have very little wintertime load, and so your summer air conditioning load becomes the pinch point. And so with software modeling, they can take your average electric use, which would be like a rectangle, where all this, I'm not drawing my lines correctly here, but you could say, okay, well, that my average load would be about, in this case, 3 kilowatts, but my peak load is 5 kilowatts. Or if you use a lot more electricity, it might be that your average load is 5 kilowatts, but your peak load is 13 kilowatts. And so if you know your month-to-month average, you can break it into daily averages, and then based on your appliances, you can say, okay, what's my average load? And then I'm just going to assume maybe a ×2 multiplier for my peak load. And then I'm going to go and check to say, okay, well, if my air conditioners are on full blast, and then I have, a base load, let's add the two together and see how that compares to my peak. So, basically by doing some conservative estimating and then oversizing the inverter from there for its output capacity. And we're going to talk about that more as we get into our modeling. But just kind of saying, okay, well, really, what are my heavy-duty electrical devices? Do I have an electric hot tub? Do I have, how many refrigerators are in my home? Are there deep freezes, mini fridges? What's the size of my air conditioners? And saying, okay, well, if all of these devices are on at the same time, is my output capacity large enough? And so when I designed an off-grid home for a client, all he had was month-by-month consumption data. And what was interesting is if we had done an annual offset, we would have gone on to PV watts. And we'll talk a little bit more about PV watts. We talk about PV watts in our solar classes because it's just a very simple tool for estimating solar performance. And so we can say, okay, well, I would need to produce 17,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. I would need, about a 12.5 kilowatt solar array. And so we've picked out our inverter capacity by kind of breaking these numbers out and doing a little bit of electrical analysis of our electrical devices. What's our maximum load? What's the maximum output of our inverter, battery inverter, to serve the load? And then it's not just your output capacity or your output capacity from your inverter, but you also have to make sure that the batteries have enough energy in them to fill up and serve the output capacity of the inverter. And so under batteryless solar, under net metered solar, you'd say, okay, how much energy do I use a year? I want to make sure at the end of the year, I'm producing as much as I'm consuming to zero out my electric bill. Well, in off-grid, you don't look at your yearly consumption. You say, I need to make sure that I'm not running out of energy at the end of the day, not at the end of the year. And so what I would look at is, not March and April, in the springtime, or October, November, in your kind of fall months. In the springtime and in the fall, you're going to produce way more electricity than you actually need. That's all right. That means in the spring and the fall, you don't really need to worry about your system so much. What you want to look at is your summertime electric use and your wintertime electric use to make sure that at the end of the month in December or at the end of the month in July, you're not running out of electricity. And that will give you a starting point for how large of a solar array you need. You're going to say, okay, well, if I'm not running out at the end of the month, what about a day-to-day basis? And we're gonna get into that in a minute. I guess this, coming back to our, and we're going to take a break in just a minute. I just want to kind of end out this section. But coming back to our economies of scale, it's like, okay, the nice thing about oversizing the system is that the larger you get, the lower dollar per watt price of that solar component you can get. So if we don't think about the battery stuff for a minute, we just focus on solar, if someone wants me to install a 4 kilowatt system, I'm going to have to charge them $3.50 a watt for that system. Otherwise, it's just not worth my time to come out and put it on their product. But if they're doing 3 pallets of solar, I can give them a $2 a watt bid. And so generally speaking, off-grid systems, you're doing larger systems, but it's not necessarily going to break the bank an 18 kilowatt system can be had for not much more than a 12 kilowatt system for reasons we discussed previously. So the next question, and after we get through this, we'll take a break. Well, the next question is, well, how do you know how many days you need to go where it's cloudy outside? And one thing to keep in mind is that there's a difference between thick clouds and just overcast. Solar will produce power on overcast days, but it might not produce any power on heavily cloudy days. When is a heavily cloudy day? Well, a hurricane is a heavily cloudy day. That's when you want that power. Well, how many days in a row do you need to go? We've calculated our inverter size by, tallying up our electrical devices and making some assumptions about these electrical devices not all being on at the same time. You can do digital controls to be more exact on that assumption. We've done our solar sizing based off PV watts, where we're looking at month to month to make sure at the end of the month, our batteries are always going to be full up. We're always going to have surplus power. So we know our solar array size, we know our inverter size. Now what we need to know is our battery bank size, how much stored power we need. And that's really, how many days in a row do we go without the solar array being on. We need enough storage in our battery bank to make sure we don't run out of juice. Well, for that, we go back to PV Watts. PV Watts is a free resource. It's available online. You just Google PV Watts and it comes up. But when you use PV Watts, you put in your system size, you put in your location, and it'll tell you how much energy the system produces per year and also per month. But if you scroll down to the bottom of the end screen on PV Watts, you can export the results on an hourly basis. And so this will tell you hour by hour, January 1st at midnight, our solar array is not doing anything. January 1st at 8 a.m., our solar array starts to turn on. At high noon, we hit our peak, and then the solar array starts to turn off. And in this data, we get some graphs. There's beam irradiance and diffuse irradiance. And we'll have mostly beam irradiance and not much diffuse irradiance on a sunny day. So we can tell that on January 1st, this is a sunny day. But here we're at January 9th, and we have almost no beam irradiance. And we have a little bit more than average diffuse irradiance because the sky is cloudy and it's diffusing the sunlight. And so there's no direct irradiance, and there's just a little bit of diffuse irradiance. And so we can see by the time we get over to system output, this is for a 1,000 watt example. And I always use 1,000 watts as the example because it's a scalar. A 7 kilowatt array will produce 7 times as much energy as a 1 kilowatt array. And so we can see the system output, at noon is around 660 watts. And then at its peak on this diffuse day, it's only getting up to about 90 or 40 watts. And then maybe the sun comes back out a little bit, in the afternoon, but not too much. And so we can see that on a diffuse day versus a sunny day, we're still producing a little bit of power, but not very much. And so the point is, on some overcast days, you will produce, maybe almost half of what you would do on a sunny day. But there are some cloudy days where you're not going to be producing where you're going to be producing 5% of what you would be doing on a sunny day. And so PV Watts, by taking actual recorded weather data in your area, will be able to tell you, by being able to inspect every single hour of the year, what is typical for your region, for your area. And so then I go and I graph that data. So here's January 1st, January 2nd, January 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. And here's that January 9th we were just looking at, where our production is very small. And so I can just tell for the month of January, here we're going through a period of 1, 2, 3, 4 days where there's almost no solar production. And here's another time where we go 1, 2 days where there's not much solar production. Another 1, 2 days, not much solar production. A little bit here, and then kind of 1, 2.5 days. And so I go and I look at, okay, well, what stretch of weather for the entire year is the longest that we go without sun? And if I know on average how much energy I'm using per month, then I can divide that by the days in the month to get how much energy I'm using on average during the day. And then I compare that with, well, what if my solar array isn't on for 4 days in a row? How much energy am I using versus how much energy am I producing on those 4 days? And that will give me what is the minimum size of the battery bank that I need to go without solar during that time frame. Now, what will add to that is backup generator capacity to get you through that. But this is if you're trying to design the system to work without reliance on a generator. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to examine this a little bit further to kind of develop our process for right-sizing our battery bank and our solar array size and our inverter capacity. So it is, why don't we go another 2 minutes so that we're at a nice even number, and then we'll take our break. So some of what comes out of this is on an off-grid array during those sunny days. What's happening is our battery bank is filling all the way back up to the top. And so on sunny days, there's going to be stranded electricity that is simply not going to be used, kind of like the electric grid. And so that's where I'm saying, you don't need to worry about efficiency so much in off-grid, because a well-designed off-grid array most days is going to fill that battery bank all the way up, and then you're going to have surplus electricity on top of that. And maybe as an architect, you could think about, well, what can I do with that surplus electricity? The computer geeks will say, oh, you can do Bitcoin mining with that surplus electricity. All right, we're not going to get into that. That's something that we might talk about in our commercial solar peaker class, but I think about like water fountains. The house we're building right here, it has a fireplace that has color-changing LED lights inside of it. So, maybe programming the fireplace to change colors based on the state of the battery would be something you could do with that. But the takeaway is you're going to have stranded electricity in a well-sized solar array. And, if you double the array capacity, you're going to get into even more stranded electricity. And so there is kind of a, what's the right size for your solar array, where increasing the size of the solar array, you'll get into diminishing returns. Because it's like, okay, well, if I double the size of my solar array, because the solar doesn't cost as much as the batteries to add more capacity. And so if I double the size of my solar array, maybe some of these less productive days where I wouldn't be filling my battery back up. If I double the size of the solar array, those overcast days where you still get production are now the equivalent of sunny days. But then there's still going to be days where you get so little production out of your array that doubling the array capacity is not going to do you any good. So there is one factor is, well, how much solar is going to push our batteries all the way up to the top, and how much solar is going to be too much. And then the other factor is how much reliance on a gas generator do we want? If there's an ice storm and all the roads are closed off and all the gas is gone, that generator's not going to do you any good. So, how much of a reliance on the generator do we want will also factor into our battery bank size. So what we say here is multi-day, we get to a critically low weather cycle, that generally are going to occur in the wintertime. And so what I like to do is kind of design my systems that are truly off-grid systems to manage the downtime. Let's say we have enough battery capacity so that we don't need a generator with the PV watts data. Because one thing you have to keep in mind is the PV watts data is telling you your typical weather. It's not going to tell you your anomalies. So that when Hurricane Sandy comes through and sits on top of your house for 2 weeks, that's an anomaly. That's not going to show up in PV watts. And so I'd say, design the system based off the PV watts data and then use your backup generator for the anomaly. And that will be able to get you through, because the customer is going to be able to recognize when there's an anomaly. When a hurricane has come through and shredded the grid, they're going to hopefully put 2 and 2 together and say, I need to not run my air conditioning so hard. I need to be more conscious of my energy use. But then again, if you're designing your battery bank to be healthy enough to get you through, what PV watts will tell you the weather data is, that's a system where the homeowner doesn't need to worry about whether or not their generator has enough gas to get them through. And that was something that I picked up on from my first customer who had the budget for, whatever he wanted. So you might have to make some other choices if you don't have a lot of budget. But, what he was saying was, look, when I hear that generator turn on, I'm going to think, oh no, I'm almost out of electricity. And he's like, I'm not trying to live off grid for more worry. I want peace of mind. And so that's where we designed his battery system to get him through the complete lull in the PV watts data. Some takeaways is that your solar array and your battery is going to have a lower levelized cost of energy than using a gas generator in most climates. I mean, if you're way up at the top of the United States or in Alaska, you may have to, because of lack of sunlight in the wintertime, go with a gas generator in the winter. But by and large, sizing the solar array and the battery to get through the winter time is going to be more cost effective than assuming that, like in January, you're not going to have any solar production at all, and you'll just run off a generator in January. At least in my experience with the design algorithms that I've looked at, it's always come out to that you want to size the battery bank and the solar array to get you through the winter month, the longest lull that you have in your PV watts data, and then just really have the generator be there as a pure backup for your extreme weather anomalies. And so what we do in our algorithm is that we pick our array size so that we never run out of power. And so that really means doing a solar array where your January production is going to be larger than your January consumption, and where your July production is going to be larger than your July consumption. And so that by and large will let you know that, every single day of the month, you're going to, every sunny day, you're going to be filling your batteries all the way back up to the top. And then you just look at how many days in a row does PV Watts say you're going to have cloudy weather, and base your battery bank size off of that. And so we take our monthly consumption data and break it out into daily and hourly even averages. And if you want, you can decrease your, wee hours of the night averages and increase your daytime averages, maybe increase them in the afternoon in the summertime and increase them in the morning in the wintertime based off the load profile data that we saw. We do have a class that's more dedicated to just hone in directly on batteries. And what we learn about lead acid batteries is they're much more efficient when being discharged slowly rather than quickly. Lithium ion is better for a quick discharge than lead acid. And so what you really want is a stable load throughout the day so that you get that what's called a C20 discharge rate. C20 referring to you would fully discharge the batteries over a 20-hour period, whereas like a C5 would be discharging the batteries over a 5-hour period. And so you really want with lead acid to discharge over a 20-hour period. And we're going to talk about strategies to do that tomorrow when we get more into the kind of the automated smart home content. By the way, we're coming out with a 6-hour class just on automated start homes starting in December based on the lessons learned from this project. So keep that in mind for your continuing education needs. Should be a really good one. Most homes are going to have kind of a maximum draw of 10 kilowatts or so, aside from momentary surges, like when the air conditioning clicks on and off. The hardest loads to manage are very spiky loads, and the spikiest loads come from tankless electric water heaters. And so, I would, in an off-grid home, I would not have a tankless water heater. Those, just one electric water heater can have like a 20 kilowatt load. And that's just, even if you have the inverter capacity to manage that load, your discharge rate is going to be ridiculous. And so tankless water heaters and lead acid batteries do not get along for that reason. It has nothing to do with it being a heating load. Heating loads are actually easier on batteries than motor loads or compressor loads like you have with air conditioners starting up. It's just that the heating load on a tankless water heater is so much for such a short period of time that it will annihilate your lead acid battery. And we're going to talk about some strategies for that for spiky loads tomorrow. But you convert your monthly consumption into daily and hourly averages. And then so here's where we do that. We go from a monthly load, we divide by the days in the month to get how many kilowatt hours a day we're consuming, and then we break that into how many kilowatts per hour we're consuming. And then I'll take that PV watts data And remember, our PV watts data is giving us an hour by hour printout of the production of our solar array measured in watts. And then we have our hourly consumption average measured in kilowatts. And so we just subtract the two. And so here we're at a -2, and here we're at a -4, and the cumulative will be -6, and then -8, and then and then when we get into the period of the sun, we start adding. And so this is for a 1 kilowatt array, but then in my Excel model I'll just have a toggle, so I'll make it a 5 kilowatt array or a 10 kilowatt array, and see how far down this tally gets, and that will tell me the minimum size of my battery bank so that we don't run out of juice. And so I'll take the PV watts data, and then I'll subtract out my consumption, and then I'll have a cell that'll give me the starting size of my battery bank. And the important thing is that my battery bank never goes negative. Or if you really want to be, fine, you don't want to discharge even these high-end lead-acid batteries. You still don't want to discharge them down more than 80%. The reason being is if your battery only has 20% of its capacity, that C20 discharge rate or that C5 discharge rate is even less energy, because your battery is really at 20% of its rated size. And so, when you get down into the very bottom of your battery, you kind of start going down a exponentially decreasing slope, such that when you're down at the very bottom of your battery and then a spiky load comes on, it'll just brick your battery and you'll run out of juice. So when we get into our Excel model tomorrow, we'll take a little bit closer look at that. But in general, I'll just take my system output, I'll subtract my hourly consumption, and then I'll start with a battery bank size and make sure this number never goes down to 0. And I'll do my Excel model based off a 1 kilowatt array, and then I'll have another cell that will basically multiply everything in this column by my array size. And so I'll just, here we start with a 120 kilowatt hour battery and an 18 kilowatt array, and I do a search for my battery level minimum. And I see, okay, well, there's one day where I get down to -241 kilowatt hours. And so it would seem that with an 18 kilowatt array and a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank, that I really need more like a 340 kilowatt hour battery bank to overcome this deficit. And by the way, I have a YouTube channel. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat, where I put the recordings of my programs. You can always send me an email. Oh, that's to the panelists. Let me send it to everyone here. And you can always send me an email if you forget that, so that you can get a recording of the program. But so what I'll do is I'll say, okay, well, I'll run a couple of different models. Instead of doing an 18 kilowatt array, I'll do a 22 kilowatt array. Instead of doing a 22 kilowatt array, I'll do a 30 kilowatt array. Instead of doing a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank, I'll do a smaller battery bank, a larger battery bank, and start seeing what happens to this minimum battery bank level. So here, in the first example, I've selected a 18 kilowatt array and a 120 kilowatt hour battery, and I get down to -241. In the next example, I've increased In the next example, I've increased the size of the array and decreased the size of the battery bank, but instead of being at negative 241, I'm at negative 122. And so what that's telling me is that, I actually needed a larger solar array and that I'm still getting good benefit from increasing my array size. And then, I'm still at this negative 122, which is unacceptable, but I'll just start playing around with my array size and my battery size to get this number positive. And so here it would be like, I think this is I go from a 22 kilowatt array up to a 28 kilowatt array, but I keep the size of my battery bank the same. I go from negative 122 to negative 94. So I see, okay, well, there's still a little bit of a benefit from increasing my array size. And then I think this was a typo. I think this was supposed to be a 14 kilowatt array. And I can see if I go from a 22 kilowatt array or 3 pallets to a 14 kilowatt array or 2 pallets, this number really increases. So I say, okay, well, 14 kilowatts is way too small. 22 kilowatts is a lot better. There's a huge leap in my minimum battery bank size by increasing my array. And then just a small leap from going from 22 up to 28, going from 3 pallets to 4 pallets. And so, if I went from 28 to another pallet, if I go from 28 to 35, all of a sudden this minimum battery level stops budging. And I know that I've peaked out on what is effective for my array size. And at that point, I need to start looking at my battery size or at my generator. So this slide doesn't have got rid of the typo. It got back down to 2 pallets and 3 pallets, 4 pallets. And so here I go from 90 kilowatt hours to 122 kilowatt hours. And so I see just from increasing my battery size by 30 kilowatt hours, well, here I go from negative 758 to negative 726. That's still not good enough. Here I increase it by 32 kilowatt hours, and my minimum capacity goes up by 32 kilowatt hours. Here I increase by 32 kilowatt hours, and my minimum capacity jumps up by more than that, or still just jumps up by 32 kilowatt hours. So I'm still increasing my battery bank size. And so at this point, I would say, okay, well, I need to either keep going up and maybe do a 35 kilowatt array, or I just bite the bullet and do a 180 kilowatt hour battery bank. Or at that point, I start looking at running a generator and seeing for how many hours a month or a year I would be running my generator, looking at my generator runtime and the cost of gas to see what's the operating cost of my generator running versus the relative cost of increasing the upfront capital expenditure of the project by increasing the battery bank size. You can program the generator to turn on at whatever depth of discharge you want it to. Graphing the data really helps you understand what's going on too. So, now we're looking at that minimum battery bank capacity. And what we can see is, the array turns on and drives. This is for a 90 kilowatt hour battery bank right here. And so we can see on January 1st and January 2nd and January 3rd, the solar array is bringing us all the way up to the top of our production. But then come January 9th, we start going into less production, and there's really no production here and no production here and no production here. And then this is a productive day here. And so I could say, okay, well, according to this, I need to add about 50 kilowatt hours of battery capacity to overcome this 1, 2, 3 days without solar. Now, at the same time, if my generator turned on at this point and brought me all the way back up to the top, then I would go through just one more day of no solar production before I get back into my sunny weather. And so it would bring all this stuff all the way back up to the top. And so I can say, okay, well, at this point, I turn my generator on. And so maybe I only need 2 days of storage and then run my generator back up to the top. And then I'm healthy again. And then I go 1, 2 days without the sun, and then the sun comes back up and drives me all the way back up to the top again. And I go 1, 2 days with absolutely no production, and my generator would have to click back on again. And so I'd really need to run my generator once during this time, and then once during this time, and then here I might be able to coast through without cranking my generator. And so I'm going to start looking at, okay, well, how many times a year I need to crank my generator to not run out of juice, and that will tell me my generator runtime, and that will tell me my cost of gas to run the generator, and then I can look at the cost of gas to run the generator versus the relative cost to increase the array size or increase the battery size. So we can see that this 90 kilowatt hour size in like March and April, I wouldn't have to run the generator at all. Even in my cloudy days, I come back and can recover the next few days. So, graphing this and developing a narrative as to what's going on is kind of helps you craft the optimization. Here we're going, in May through September, we're doing just fine. Then October comes around. And this is kind of funny. This is in October, and we're getting down to almost the minimum. And then here in November, we're getting down to the very minimum. And so what we can see is with this 90 kilowatt hour battery bank, I would have to run the generator once and then probably another twice. But then these sunny days, if I'm running my generator, that would get me back up into a pattern that kind of looks like this. And then I'd have to run the generator again once, twice, 3 times. Well, and then I'm also hitting zero during these other times where I'm just barely getting down to zero before the sunny day comes and recovers. And so that's where I'm saying, okay, well, if I'm at 90 kilowatt hours and I am going to have to run the generator a couple of times, but if I actually go and I add another 30 kilowatt hours to my battery bank, and not do a maximum capacity of 90, but instead do a maximum capacity of 120, I still have to run the generator during this time and this time, but during these 2 times, I wouldn't have to run the generator. And so I reduce my reliance on the generator by going from a 90 kilowatt hour size to 120 kilowatt hours. And so it's kind of a optimization at that point to say, what is an acceptable amount of risk for the client in running the generator versus slightly increasing the battery bank size, maybe not to do the full amount that I need to avoid reliance on the generator, but also to do enough so that there are some days that I can just not run the generator and still have enough capacity. So graphing it visually does help. And you might not run the generator all the way back up to the top either. I mean, as we talk about in our battery classes, what you really want to try and do with your generator is get you out of the bottom range of the battery and get you back up into this top range of the battery, particularly for lead acid that promotes your healthier lead acid life. And so then I take my Excel model, and I've had my array size as a scalar, my battery size, and then I add an additional column for my generator runtime. And so in this case, it's a 15 kilowatt generator, and it runs for at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m. to kind of recharge my battery bank. So my battery bank starts out, on January 10th at 35 kilowatt hours, and it dips all the way down to a 20% depth of discharge. At that point, the generator clicks on, and I run my generator for 1, 2, 3 hours. So then I tally up how many hours in the year I'm running my generator, and I can look at my generator efficiency, how much gas it'll consume, and associate a cost with that, and compare that cost to the relative cost of going from a 90 kilowatt hour battery to 120, or going from 120 to 350 to not need the generator at all. So in conclusion, there's going to be a lot of days, most days in your off-grid house where you're going to have plenty of electricity. The generator is there to run just a couple of times a year to get you through those days where you would normally need, 6 or 7 days worth of storage to get you down to about 2 or 3 days worth of storage. And you just have to balance that against the upfront cost of batteries. So let's talk a little about battery selection. It's kind of bullet points. The Tesla Powerwall, you look at the pricing guidance from Tesla, and you look at its warranted life, it costs about 17.5 cents a kilowatt hour to run, which for most of the United States is going to be above your cost of electricity. And for most of the United States, even when you have a time of use rate structure where you can have a higher rate during the day and a lower rate at night, you think, okay, well, I'm going to charge my battery at night and discharge it during the day. The cost to run the battery is usually greater than the differential between peak and off-peak rates. And I suspect utilities will follow the levelized cost of running lithium-ion batteries and always have that time of day differential be less than the cost of running a battery to avoid revenue loss. Lead acid is really interesting to me. If I'm rapidly discharging my lead acid over a 2-hour time frame, it's not to say that you can't do that, but you lose so much efficiency that it's more effective on a 2-hour discharge to use lithium ion than lead acid. But lead acid really gains its efficiency when you can discharge it slowly, and given that in an off-grid house, you're going to want more than 1 day's worth of storage. We're not talking about a couple of hours to cover critical loads during a blackout. We're talking about running the whole house for multiple days, even when it's not sunny. And so if you have, 2 days worth of storage in your lead acid battery, it should be discharging at a much slower rate than fully discharging over 2 hours. And so you should achieve a C20 discharge rate, even when you're in the summertime under a heavier electric load than March or April. And so you do the levelized cost of storage calculation at a C20 discharge rate, and the industrial flooded lead acid battery becomes substantially cheaper than lithium ion. And so that's perhaps why you see a lot of commercial clients who are trying to discharge lithium ion very quickly during peak times go with lithium ion, and yet the off-gridders are still saying, look, lithium ion is too expensive to run your whole house off grid unless you're in a market like California or Hawaii. If you're in middle America, lead acid is the only thing that's going to get you anything resembling, the price of grid electricity. We'll talk more about that later. Now, one thing that really surprised me is that there is a huge quality difference within the lead acid battery product class. And there's like a old saying that says, quality is measured by weight. And it turns out that your top quality lead acid batteries weigh a heck of a lot more per kilowatt hour of storage than your mid-range lead acid batteries. Even within a battery that's marketed as a solar battery or a renewable battery or a deep cycle battery, compared to industrial batteries, they're called industrial flooded lead acid. Their most common use is forklifts. And you get industrial non-forklift batteries. Forklift batteries are generally 48 volts packaged together, and they weigh as much as 4 12-volt industrial flooded lead acid batteries. And so you usually will not use a forklift battery to run a house off grid because it's simply too heavy to move around. Even your 12-volt lead acid industrial batteries will weigh 800 pounds. When I order my 12-volt industrial flooded lead acid batteries, I have to tell the battery manufacturer not to ship them 4 to a pallet, because 8 times 4 is 3,200 pounds, and most lift gates from shippers are only rated for 3,000 pounds. So when I order my industrial flooded lead acid batteries, I usually have to specify, hey, I'll pay the shipping charge, but give me, if I'm ordering 4 batteries, I want them shipped 2 to a pallet, not 4 to a pallet, so I can actually offload them on site and pick them up and move them around with a truck and a hoist rather than needing more expensive equipment. Although I have used forklift batteries that weigh 3,000 pounds when I'm building a residential new construction and I already have heavy-duty lift equipment on site. It kind of depends on your project. But I know many solar installers who will go into the non-industrial flooded lead acid class simply because of the logistics of being able to pick the batteries up and set them back down. But if you look at non-industrial batteries versus industrial batteries, the industrial batteries weigh 50% more per kilowatt hour stored than what are commonly marketed as renewable batteries or solar batteries. Well, this is just some pictures of some lift equipment. Um, there's also a difference between sealed lead acid and unsealed lead acid. And we go this into more detail in our battery class. But the takeaway is the only cheap lead acid, when I'm talking about how I'm a big fan of lead acid, I am not talking about sealed lead acid. Lead acid needs to be conditioned. And when you charge a lead acid battery, it produces gas. And in a sealed lead acid, that gas stays inside the battery. And so there's limitations with how much you can charge and condition a sealed lead acid battery. Therefore, a sealed lead acid battery, there's no maintenance because the gas doesn't escape. With an unsealed lead acid, the gas escapes, and so you have to keep adding water to the battery to make up for the gas that's escaped. Well, it's like, okay, well, if I just talk to someone who's like, well, do you want to have a battery that you have to maintain or a battery you don't have to maintain? They're going to say, well, I want the battery that I don't have to maintain. But the batteries that you just add water to, it is easier than doing an oil change on your car. They have watering kits that make the process all of 1 or 2 minutes to do. But the unsealed lead acid batteries that you water, because you can condition them, they will last substantially longer than the sealed lead acid. So, I would put the sealed lead acid batteries in the same price range as where lithium ion will be in a couple of years. Whereas the unsealed lead acid is still by far and away the cheapest market-ready form of storage, and that capital expenditure on the batteries is so much that, unless you're selling your systems to, multimillionaires who are really just building off grid for fun or because the site is so remote, or very small applications where you don't need a large battery bank, but the cost of doing maintenance on a remote small location may be prohibitive. But if we're just talking about regular sized homes, an unsealed lead acid is what I'm talking about for the purposes of this class. So then it becomes a point of, okay, well, if you have a 48-volt battery inverter and you're buying your batteries in 12-volt components, there's still a maximum density that you can fit into a 12-volt unsealed flooded lead acid battery. And so one circuit of 12-volt batteries, there is an upper limit to how much energy can be on that circuit. The problem when you have multiple battery circuits is these battery cables are going to have different lengths when they land on the inverter. And if the battery cables have different lengths, you're going to get a different amount of resistance and therefore a different amount of current being pulled out of your parallel strings of batteries. And once one cell starts to go bad in that overworked circuit, it starts to degrade the batteries on that circuit, and eventually it degrades the batteries on that system. And for that reason, most battery inverter manufacturers recommend, the best is just to have one circuit of batteries. Have all the storage you need on that one circuit. But the next best thing is to have 2 circuits of batteries and put them right next to each other. And then the battery manufacturer that I tend to use say, well, they'll support up to 3 circuits of parallel batteries. But beyond that, they're not going to honor the warranty because of the difference in resistance from the home run circuits. What you looking for?
I'm just checking out the cabinets. I think we're
right. And so often your battery inverters are only going to have one terminal, sometimes two terminals for your battery circuits to land on. So, just keep in mind it's not a best practice to have 3 or more circuits of batteries feeding one battery inverter. And so for that reason, depending on the amount of batteries you need, like in our past example, we spec'd out 120 kilowatt hours, but that required a reliance on a generator. But there's a maximum amount of power you can squeeze out of one 48-volt battery bank. So here's our product line, and we see there's a little bit lighter weight industrial flooded lead acid that's 12 volts and it stores 845 amp hours. And then their most heavy one is 12 volts with 1690 amp hours. So if we selected their most dense, heaviest industrial flooded lead acid, we put 1690 amp hours times 48 volts. That's a maximum of 160 kilowatt hours on one string. And so if we needed 350 kilowatt hours, the best thing to do is to select the heaviest 12-volt industrial flooded lead acid and do 2 circuits. If we tried to go for something more lightweight, then we would need 3 circuits or 4 circuits, and that would not be good for the overall health of the battery in the long run. So there's a couple of things you need to check when you're ordering your batteries, and it's mainly, do you have enough storage to fit into 2 circuits of batteries or less? And then what's the weight of those batteries to make sure you don't get tripped up in your shipping logistics? For battery maintenance, there's some watering kits. And so, when you're maintaining your batteries, I think we have some better pictures. Yeah, right here. There's little holes in the battery that you'd add water to. And so the watering kits have little caps in them with interconnected tubes. And you get almost like a super soaker on wheels. You just put air pressure into this tank and you squeeze the trigger on this gun and connect it to the end cap, and it just squirts water into all of the individual cells of the battery and cuts them off when they're at the right level. And that's the easiest way to do it. I suppose you can do it with, gallons of distilled water and funnels. But it takes, it's a lot quicker. If you just have the watering tank and the watering kit, adding water to your battery bank takes all of 2 minutes. If you don't, then you have to unscrew each individual cap and put the funnel in and pour the water in and make sure you're getting the right water level size, and it's not as precise and it's not as good. There's even automated watering kits that you can buy to hook them all up and have the automated watering kits water your batteries for you. But I have found that watering batteries is a very simple and easy and enjoyable job for the client. It's not something that is, even mowing your lawn is more annoying than watering your batteries. Now, there is another step for flooded lead acid battery maintenance, and it's a device, this is on the quiz, that's called a hydrometer. And basically, voltage is not a good way to measure battery life. And the reason is your voltage, it kind of looks like this. And so this is when your battery is being conditioned. This is when your battery's fully charged. This is when your battery is deeply discharged and you really want to turn your generator on at that point. This is when you want to, kind of stop using your battery so hard. And this is when you're in the danger zone for your battery. And so just honing in on this middle section, a fully charged battery may be at 53 volts, and a battery that's about to be completely discharged is at 49 volts. And there's this big plateau in between. So it's just taking a voltmeter and sticking it on the battery is not a good way of measuring battery health or battery state of charge. What a hydrometer does is it measures the specific gravity of the electrolyte that's inside the battery, and that is what you record on a periodic basis to keep track of the battery cell health. So in addition to watering the batteries, it's good, perhaps not as regularly. You're watering these batteries in the summertime once a week. Maybe in the spring or the fall when you're not using the batteries as much, you're watering them once every 3 weeks. But in prime time usage, you're watering these batteries once a week. You don't have to do the specific gravity reading once a week, but the manufacturer will generally recommend doing the specific gravity readings once a month. You're not measuring every single cell in the battery. Generally, you'll measure one cell in each battery once a month, and then rotate. The next year, you check the second cell. The next year, you check the third cell. The next year, you check the fourth cell, and you just kind of rotate them that way. So in conclusion, the unsealed flooded lead acid batteries that you have to add water to are going to be the best bang for your buck, provided that the owner is willing to do a little bit of basic maintenance, very basic maintenance. Problem is, if you don't add the water to the batteries, you can destroy it. So, I had a client who, we'd used a forklift battery, and the only instruction was make sure the battery water level does not drop below the plates. Well, then he used the battery that was supposed to be used twice a week, for a weekend cabin. Well, he built his cabin using the system, so he's using the battery every single day. And then he had his aunt and uncle move in their trailer, and they plugged up to the battery, and they're running not just their home construction off the battery, but also a mobile trailer. And it's the winter time, and they're using everything electric, and they're using, it's a 6 kilowatt system, and they're using a 4 kilowatt electric heater on top of a 2 kilowatt compressor, and not watering the battery, and it completely discharged the battery. And, at that point, you have to, you're lucky if you can resurrect the battery by applying very high voltage to it. That's something you cannot do with a sealed battery. You can only do it with unsealed batteries, so you do get into refurbished, unsealed flooded lead acid. Basically, your batteries down inside it will accumulate barnacles that eventually plate the battery anodes that are hanging out in the electrolyte. And once those anodes get covered with barnacles, they can't press any electrons through the anodes anymore. So applying high voltage to the battery will bust the anodes off. So when I look at batteries that you can maintain, I look at it as batteries that you can condition, batteries that you can be a little harder on, batteries that if you don't treat them as they are designed for, but overload them, that you can actually get yourself out of a bad situation. Whereas the sealed batteries, they can't take aggressive charging, so they can't take a high enough voltage to bust the barnacles off of the anode. So let's talk about inverter selection. I think the biggest difference between battery inverters is a feature called a stackable inverter. So a stackable inverter is when you have one battery inverter and you can simply, if you want more power, you can add another battery inverter right next to it. And then another battery inverter right next to it, and then another battery inverter right next to it. You can scale them all the way up to go from running an off-grid home to running an off-grid office building. These are stackable battery inverters. So my first off-grid client, for some reason, they have two closed dryers, and they can only run them one at a time. If they run them two at a time, that plus the air conditioner load causes their breaker to trip. And you say, well, you know what? You bought the stackable inverter. If that's really an issue that bothers you, we can always add on another battery inverter and increase the output capacity of the system if you want. Alternately, there are battery inverters that are not stackable. There's one inverter for the entire system. So generally speaking, the one inverter for the entire system is going to be cheaper than a stackable inverter. However, it's going to be substantially cheaper than a stackable inverter. And this is why. First off, the stackable inverters have communication systems that go between the two, and they kind of communicate in tandem. So there's more controls and stuff going on, so there's more stuff inside them. So per unit, they are more expensive. Secondly, the all-in-one inverters are generally larger, and so just through economies of scale, buying one big thing is going to be cheaper than buying a bunch of small things. And so that's another reason why they're cheaper. Thirdly, and this is perhaps the biggest expense, on a stackable inverter, you got to wire them together. And so that means in addition to the two inverters, you need to have a switch gear with a bunch of breakers on it to wire them all in parallel to each other. And this is generally going to be a specialty component. You can't go to Home Depot and buy, DC breakers and DC service panels. And even though some service panels are rated for both AC and DC, and some breakers are rated for both AC and DC, keep in mind, we're dealing with low voltage, like 48 volts, and very high amperage, like 1,000 amps. And you go look at the breakers on your service panel, they're all 20 amps, 30 amps, and the main breakers are 200 amps. It's just very hard to find high amperage breakers, and they're expensive. And what I do is, since I've been in the market for a while, I go and I look at the breakers that the inverter manufacturer sells, and they're all manufactured by third parties. And so I go and I find on eBay the third party manufacturer, and that takes a $100 breaker and knocks the price down to about $40. So the supply chain markup on this specialty stuff is pretty big too. But generally it's handy because it's hard to find, when you're building your own breaker box, it's hard to find a bus bar that's rated for high amperage. It's hard to find a bus bar that has all the lugs you need to tie things onto. This is a service panel that's made by Schneider, and they have an AC side to the panel and a DC side to the panel. Otherwise, you'd have to buy an AC panel and a DC panel. So, some of this balance of system material is costly, and you can eliminate it by getting an all-in-one inverter. So when I built the off-grid house where we're broadcasting, we went with an all-in-one because we had a limited budget. And when you have a limited budget, you want to get the largest all-in-one inverter you have and then restrict the electric use in the house to fit that. The danger being if they're building the house and then they realize that the foundation soil is not good enough, so they have to dig down deeper. And because they're digging down deeper, they decide instead of being a 2-story house, we're going to go with a 3-story house. And then they realize that their hot tub is an electric hot tub and not a gas hot tub. And then they add an electric sauna. And because the house is now 3 stories, now they have, 2 15 kilowatt air conditioner units instead of 1. And, and now they have electric device this and electric device that. You can box yourself into a corner with your all-in-one battery inverter. And so on this particular house, we have 2 200 amp service panels because of so many circuits involved. And the electrical scope basically doubled during the construction phase compared to what they gave me during the design phase. And, we selected an all-in-one inverter because to go to the stackable side for the same output capacity, but just to get us the stackable inverter, by the time we buy 2 smaller inverters instead of 1 large inverter, plus all the switch gear to interconnect everything together, we would have had to spend, twice as much on our electrical components as we did initially. Except then we would have had room for expansion. But we had a limited budget. So the way we're remedying this is 2 ways. 1, digital controls, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. And 2, we're just running half of the house off grid. The main floor for the family of 2 is living year round. And then the rest of the house is grid tied. And that's not an ideal situation. We got some tips and tricks where we're going to expand the system to move it back to where we wanted to down the road. The idea of a all-in-one inverter that is not expandable is a concept given by the manufacturer. But if you read the technical detail, that's not the end all. And we're going to talk about that tomorrow. Like these all-in-one transfer switches, all-in-one inverters will generally have a transfer switch built into it for grid charging. On top of that, the all-in-one inverters are generally one way. And so the grid comes in, but the inverter only has a separate output. And so the inverter output is not grid tied. The inverter input is grid tied, but the inverter output only goes into the load. Whereas your stackable inverters are typically grid tied and are bidirectional and can feed the grid and then also, feed the home. And that 2-way street, that bidirectionality is A, more expensive, and B, gets you into grid interconnection issues and solar discriminatory rate structures like we talked about earlier. And so we're looking at, about $5,000 for a 12 kilowatt inverter that might not be UL listed. It might be listed to, European standards. Some local jurisdictions require UL listing. The internal transfer switch, the utility might come in and say, we want to see an external transfer switch. We understand it as an internal switch, but we want to see an external switch. There's also no double redundancy. You know, what's nice about a stackable inverter is if one fails, you at least have the other one to help you get along until the other unit is swapped out. Well, with an all-in-one, if it fails, well, then you got to run off a generator full time until you get it swapped out. So it's a little bit more of an urgent fix. Well, you know, comparatively, $5,000 for a 12 kilowatt inverter versus $6,000 for two 6 kilowatt inverters, plus the specialized panel, plus all the wiring associated with it, which you don't have on the all-in-one unit. You know, and I really kind of lowballed this estimate. It probably would be a couple grand more than that at the end of the day. But it's nicer. You know, you get what you pay for. And so when you're looking at the cost between what's like the minimum acceptable system for living off grid versus a more luxurious system that could be grid tied and is stackable, it turns out to be a relatively large cost difference. And that cost could go into more batteries, which would improve your off-grid capabilities. This is just to say that the grid tied battery inverters that are for lead acid 48 volt, not for lithium ion per se, they do have more functions that you might not use in the off-grid setting. There are minimum battery bank sizes that the inverters require to operate. So we look at like this Schneider battery inverter. It has a minimum battery bank size of 440 amp hours. So the very minimum is you could run it in a 24 volt setting and just put 10 kilowatt hours of flooded lead acid on it. Except it would only output 3.4 kilowatt hours of output at that time. That's something I learned since making this slide. And also, the 10 kilowatt hours is not a lot. It might be enough to power a critical load so that your refrigerator runs or your electronics don't lose power. When designing an off-grid system, you're going to be faced with a choice of, do you want to use charge controllers, which is called DC coupling, or inverters only, which is called AC coupling. So charge controllers do the same thing as inverters in that they get the power from your solar array to your load. So in batteryless solar, you go from solar into a batteryless inverter and then into your load. With charge controllers, you go from the solar array through your charge controller into your battery bank. And so your solar array is at 600 volts, your battery bank is at 48 volts, and this will step your 600 volts down to 48 volts. Your inverter goes into 240 volts AC, and it'll take the DC 600 volts and turn it into an AC 240 volts. So they do kind of the same thing. The biggest difference between AC coupling and DC coupling is that with AC coupling, you have to remember these AC inverters are designed to lose power when the grid goes down. And so if the grid goes down and then you run out of juice in your batteries, well then the sun comes up and your inverter's still off and you can't get that power into the batteries. Whereas with charge controllers, if your battery bank loses juice overnight, the sun comes back up and it restarts them. So DC coupling, you're able to black start the system. AC coupling, you're going to need to crank a generator or program your battery inverter not to fully discharge so that you can turn your solar array back on. So if you're living off grid, DC coupling is kind of the better way to do it. If you're grid tied, AC coupling is a little bit better because you're not, here you're processing the electricity through the charge controller and then through the inverter into your load. Whereas if you're grid tied, you can go directly into the load or directly into the grid with just one process. And so the AC coupling is a little bit more efficient when you're using every single kilowatt hour, such as you would when you're selling back to the grid. DC coupling, technically, it should be more efficient, and technically, it should be more cost effective, but there's been so much development into batteryless solar that your inverters, even though they're processing the electricity and inverting the electricity, whereas your charge controllers are just processing the electricity and keeping it DC to DC. So there's less stuff in a charge controller than there is in an inverter. So the charge controllers should be cheaper than the inverters. There's so much more manufacturing support of batteryless inverters that the batteryless inverters are essentially the same price point as your charge controllers. And so since most systems will have a generator anyway for black starting the system or for preventing the batteries from fully discharging, there's really no good reason to do DC versus AC. If you're doing the little cabin in the woods and you don't want to have to rely on a generator to turn the system back on if you lose all your electricity, then DC coupling is the better way to go. I like DC coupling better because of that, but I'm not wed to it. And like I said earlier, almost always you're adding a generator to the system, so DC coupling versus AC coupling really doesn't matter that much. In fact, if your solar array is on one side of the property and your battery bank is on the other side of the property, when you're trying to build a microgrid, AC coupling is a better way to go. DC coupling, you kind of got to bring everything into the same location. And you can do both. You can have your battery bank with a small solar array and a small charge controller so that it can black start, and then do AC coupled solar on top of that. The caveat being it works a lot better if you stay within the same manufacturer, because then you're just running Ethernet between the two and they can communicate with each other. When you're AC coupling solar with batteries, you have to be concerned about if the batteries are full and your solar array is on and your load is not taking all the power of the solar array, that you're going to be backfeeding the batteries and overcharging them, applying too much voltage to the batteries. And so the stackable, more expensive battery inverters will trick your batteryless solar. They will, once the batteries are full, they will change the frequency of the grid and trigger the shutdown capability of the batteryless inverters. Just like when the grid goes out, the batteryless inverters turn off. your battery inverters can mimic a grid failure by just adjusting the frequency a little bit, not enough that you would notice in your electric use, but enough to trigger the shutdown feature of the batteryless inverter. So if you plan on doing AC coupling, making sure, and you're not using the same product line of your battery inverter versus your batteryless inverter, you got to make sure you have a feature called frequency shifting in order for that all to work together in a friendly manner. The charge controllers on the market are, the wide variety of batteryless solar inverters spoils me. There's not many charge controller manufacturers on the market. In fact, the biggest thing is that it's very hard to find 600-volt charge controllers. Only Schneider and Morningstar have 600-volt charge controllers. Outback has a 300-volt. Midnight, I think they're at 150 volts. Maybe they have a 250-volt. Others are only on 150 volts. And the reason for that is because if you go from a 600-volt solar array down to a 48-volt battery, that's a big leap, and it's not very efficient. And so it's more efficient to go from 150 volts down to 48 volts. The problem is with solar, do I illustrate this point? Yeah. I guess I don't illustrate it that well. But with a 600-volt circuit, you can fit 9 or 10 solar panels on a given circuit. With 150-volt, you can only fit 3 solar panels on a circuit. And so if your solar array is up on a rooftop, you don't want to deal with a whole bunch of circuits and a whole bunch of wiring. So when I'm doing off-grid on a roof, I like that 600-volt circuit. And that really just pegs me into either Schneider or Morningstar at this time. Now, on a ground mount, dealing with the wiring is not that big of a deal. So, Outback and Magnum and Midnight, those other manufacturers are a little bit more acceptable. And we talked about these breakers where, this was one I thought was really egregious. Schneider, their 600-volt charge controller lands on a 100-amp breaker, and they charge $100 per breaker. And so I tracked down the OEM of the breaker, and I found they were ganged together, but it was 3 100-amp breakers for $50 instead of one 100-amp breaker for $100. And that's where the specialty components for charge controllers in particular can really run away with you, because there's just not as much market demand for them. So they're fewer and further between. There's a company that just got bought by Generac called Pica, and they kind of solved this problem by doing, instead of 600-volt strings, they do 400-volt strings. And then they have a charge controller up on the rooftop, and then they run it into their, what they call a smart battery, lithium-ion battery at 400 volts, and they keep their battery inverter at 400 volts. And so it results in a very efficient system. And they've also developed a sealed flooded lead acid that runs at high voltage along this.